And instead of admitting he didn't know the answer to a question, he winged it. He was asked when the travel regulations go into effect, and he said, immediately. Immediately, crowds began massing at the 6 gates to the Berlin Wall. And at one of them, the border guards decided that discretion was the better part of valor, and they opened the gates. And with that, a pivotal decision, like the Polish elections, had been made. There's going to be no going back. Within the week.
Have you ever wondered why the most powerful figures in history, leaders with vast armies, infinite resources, and absolute control, eventually make the one mistake that destroys everything they've built? It isn't a lack of intelligence. It is a lack of what experts call grand strategy. We are living in a moment where the world feels like it is tilting on its axis. You see the headlines, you see the borders shifting, and you feel that familiar weight of uncertainty. But what if I told you that what we are witnessing today is not just a modern conflict, but a recurring ghost of history, a ghost that haunts those who believe that territory is the only currency of power? Today, we are not just talking about war, we are decoding the death ground trap, a pivotal error that has toppled empires from Tokyo to Berlin and is now knocking on the doors of the modern era. To understand the present, we must step back into the world of strategy. Many people think strategy is just about winning the next battle. But as Professor Sarah Paine, one of the most brilliant military historians at the Naval War College, argues, that is a dangerous simplification. National power is like a symphony. If only the drums of the military are playing and the rest of the orchestra, finance, diplomacy, and social cohesion is silenced, the result is not music, it is noise. And eventually, that noise leads to a catastrophic collapse. Grand strategy is the integration of all relevant instruments of national power. Imagine a table where a leader sits. In a functioning system, the people around that table, the finance ministers, the diplomats, and the generals must argue. They must clash. This internal friction is actually a country's greatest strength because it prevents a leader from falling in love with a bad idea. When you eliminate the counter-argument, you eliminate your own safety net. Look at history's mirror. Before the collapse of great powers in the past, we often see the same pattern. The military instruments begin to dominate all others. Leaders stop listening to the economists who warn that the war is unaffordable. They focus only on operational success, winning the next hill or taking the next city, while losing sight of the strategic objective. They have a military plan, but they have no grand strategy. They forget that an army is only as strong as the economy that feeds it and the diplomacy that justifies its existence. Since the Industrial Revolution, the world has been divided into 2 fundamental ways of thinking. First, the Maritime Order, where wealth is compounded through rules, trade, and alliances. It is a win-win system where everyone's credit card works across borders. Second, the Continental Order, where power is seized through territorial conquest. The tragedy of the continental view is that it is a negative-sum game. You often destroy the very wealth you seek to capture, leaving you with nothing but burnt land and a hollowed-out future. Today, we see this struggle playing out again, a 19th century mindset clashing with a 21st century reality. When a leader makes a pivotal error, a decision from which there is no return, they put their entire nation on death ground. And on death ground, as we are about to see, the rules of human behavior change in ways that no dictator can predict. In the world of strategy, there is a concept as ancient as war itself, yet as relevant as today's headlines. It is called death ground. Originally defined by the legendary Sun Tzu, death ground is a psychological state that occurs when an enemy is backed into a corner with no hope of escape. In this state, the odds of survival are low, but because there is no other choice, the human will to fight becomes superhuman. This is the invisible force that many dictators, in their overconfidence, fail to calculate. They believe that a massive display of force will lead to a rapid collapse, but instead, they accidentally put their enemy on death ground, conjuring a formidable resistance that didn't exist before. Look at the history of Eastern Europe. Before the mid-20th century, national identities were often fluid or fragmented, but when the Nazis moved into Ukraine and forced people to dig their own mass graves, they fundamentally changed the landscape. Initially, many Ukrainians had welcomed the German forces as a relief from the brutal famines imposed by the previous regime. But the moment they realized the new invaders intended to annihilate them, They were placed on death ground. They realized that coexistence was impossible. This realization superglued a national identity together that has lasted for generations. We see this tragic irony repeat itself in the present. Before recent escalations, the internal politics of Ukraine were complex, with many citizens feeling cultural or linguistic ties to their neighbors. However, the use of extreme brutality and the destruction of civilian infrastructure has acted as a catalyst. When your apartment building is leveled by those who claim to be your brothers, the illusion of coexistence vanishes. In his attempt to erase a nation, the aggressor has instead become the chief architect of its modern identity. This is a classic strategic failure. By removing the enemy's option to surrender or coexist, you make them invincible in spirit. Throughout history, the victors of war are often the ones who understand this psychological boundary. In the American Civil War or the occupation of post-war Japan, the objective was not the annihilation of the people, but the removal of a toxic leadership. The people were not put on death ground. Even in the face of firebombing and exhaustion, the Japanese people eventually realized that their survival lay in rebuilding, not in a collective suicide. Why? Because the occupiers provided a path back to the international community. They offered a future. When a leader ignores this principle, they trade a short-term victory for a long-term insurgency. You can seize territory, but if you have turned the population into a permanent enemy, you will choke on your acquisitions. History shows that borders are never stable when they are drawn with the blood of a population that refuses to be dominated. This is the warning that the past sends to the present. You can conquer the land, but you cannot govern a people you have placed on death ground. As the struggle continues, it becomes less about the military hardware and more about the endurance of a nation that has been forced to realize its own strength. To truly grasp the magnitude of the current global shift, we must look at the two competing visions of how a nation builds security and wealth. This is the fundamental divide that Professor Sarah Paine highlights, the clash between the maritime and the continental mindsets. For centuries, traditional continental empires believed that power was a matter of maps. The more land you controlled, the more powerful you were. They operated on a zero-sum logic. For me to win, you must lose. If I want your resources, I must seize your territory. This mindset leads to a constant cycle of invasion, occupation, and the brutal suppression of neighbors to maintain buffer zones. It is a world of walls, trenches, and closed borders. In contrast, the Maritime Order offers a completely different alternative that emerged with the Industrial Revolution and accelerated after World War II. In this system, wealth is not seized, it is created. It is a win-win paradigm based on trade, international law, and the freedom of the seas. Maritime powers, like the United States and Britain, realize that it is far more profitable to run credit card transactions across the globe than to pay for the massive cost of occupying a hostile population. In the maritime world, security comes from alliances and the smooth flow of goods. If everyone follows the same set of rules, everyone can compound their wealth. This is the party that the West invited the world to join, including Russia and China, after the Cold War ended. The tragedy we are seeing today is a pivotal error where a leader chooses the continental path in a maritime age. When Putin looks at Ukraine, he sees territory, buffer zones, and historical borders. He is playing a 19th century game of land conquest. But in doing so, he has disconnected Russia from the maritime credit card system that provided its prosperity. By seizing land, he has triggered sanctions that suppress growth for generations. History teaches us that continental empires eventually choke on their acquisitions. They spend so much on their armies and secret police that they have nothing left for their roads, their hospitals, or their innovators. Consider the difference in outcomes. Countries that embraced the Maritime Order like post-war Japan and South Korea saw their standards of living skyrocket despite having almost no natural resources. They traded their way to greatness. Meanwhile, continental powers that isolate themselves often end up like North Korea, heavily armed, paranoid, and impoverished. The maritime system isn't just about money. It's about a rules-based order that protects sovereignty. It says that just because you are big, you cannot simply erase your smaller neighbor. When that rule is broken, the maritime world reacts by withdrawing the very thing the aggressor needs to survive: access to the global economy. This is the invisible wall that is closing in, proving that in the 21st century, you cannot be a superpower if you only understand the language of the land. One of the most profound dangers in any nation's grand strategy is not the lack of weapons, but the death of information. In a healthy democracy, information flows upward, often through friction, criticism, and messy public debates. But in a dictatorship, information is filtered through fear. This leads to a strategic disease known as hubris, an overbearing pride that blinds a leader to reality. When a leader eliminates the counter-argument, they don't just silence their critics. They silence the very warnings they need to survive. This is why dictators, despite their perceived strength, often make the most stupid or irrational mistakes. It isn't necessarily a lack of intelligence, it is a lack of accurate data. Look at the history of Imperial Japan leading up to the attack on Pearl Harbor. The military had effectively silenced the civilian cabinet. Journalists were censored, and finance ministers who warned of economic ruin were ignored or even assassinated. By the time the decision was made to engage the United States, the Japanese leadership was living in a fantasy of their own making. They believed that one swift blow would make the weak Americans quit. They didn't have anyone at the table to tell them that the American industrial output was 10 times their own. They were winning battles on paper while losing the war in reality. Hubris had turned their grand strategy into a suicide pact. We see this same pattern in modern pivotal errors. When a system is built on a monopoly of power, like the Chinese Communist Party or the Kremlin, the leader is often the last person to know the truth. Subordinates are incentivized to lie, reporting only successes while hiding failures. This information gap leads to catastrophic miscalculations. For instance, the initial belief that a neighboring nation would not fight back or that the international community would remain silent is almost always a result of a leader surrounded by yes men. They mistake their own propaganda for a strategic assessment. The cost of this hubris is paid in lives and long-term prosperity. In a maritime order, mistakes are corrected through public accountability and market shifts. If a policy fails, the government is voted out or the economy adjusts. But in a continental dictatorship, there is no back-down plan, only a double-down plan. Because the leader's ego is tied to the national identity, admitting a mistake is seen as a fatal weakness. This leads to a long, grinding descent into isolation. As the truth finally breaks through the wall of lies, it often arrives too late to save the empire. This is the ultimate warning of history. A leader who refuses to hear the truth will eventually be forced to feel the consequences of his own blindness. One of the most persistent myths in global politics is that autocracies are more efficient than democracies. On the surface, it is an easy argument to make. A dictator can decide on a war, a budget, or a law in a single afternoon, while a democracy might spend months or even years in gridlock. But as history and Professor Sarah Paine suggest, this perceived efficiency is actually a strategic trap. The speed of a dictatorship is the speed of a car without brakes. It moves fast, but it cannot stop when it heads toward a cliff. Democracy, with all its messiness, has an internal braking system, the ability to self-correct. In a democratic maritime order, power is distributed. When a leader makes a mistake, the press exposes it, the courts challenge it, and the voters eventually change the leadership. This friction is not a bug, it is a feature. It ensures that a single pivotal error does not lead to the total collapse of the nation. In contrast, an autocrat's efficiency is often just the absence of accountability. When a dictator is wrong, the entire country is forced to be wrong with him. There is no mechanism to say no, no way to adjust course until the disaster has already unfolded. This is why democracies, though they start slow, tend to win long wars of attrition. They have the social resilience to endure losses because the people feel a sense of ownership in the system. Consider the aftermath of catastrophic failures. When a democracy fails, it undergoes a process of public inquiry and reform. It builds new institutions to prevent the same mistake. When an autocracy fails, it often leads to a death ground scenario where the regime must either double down on violence or face total disintegration. The lack of a legitimate succession plan or a way to vent public frustration means that every crisis in a dictatorship is potentially existential. The regime spends more energy protecting itself from its own people than it does protecting the nation from external threats. Ultimately, the The maritime world's strength lies in its voluntary nature. Alliances like NATO or trade blocs are not maintained by the threat of invasion, but by mutual interest. If a member country feels the alliance no longer serves them, they can negotiate or even leave. This voluntary participation creates a robust network that is far more stable than a continental empire held together by force. The long-term stability of the West is not based on the brilliance of a single general or leader, but on the strength of institutions that outlive any individual. As we look at the compounding effects of growth and stability, it becomes clear. The inefficient democracy that listens to its people will always outlast the efficient autocracy that only listens to itself. One of the most significant strategic advantages of a maritime power is its ability to build and maintain robust, voluntary alliances. In a continental system, alliances are often just a polite word for subjection. A dominant land power creates buffer states not through shared values, but through the threat of the tank and the secret police. But as history shows, these forced partnerships are inherently brittle. The moment the central power weakens, the satellite states rebel because they were never there by choice. In contrast, maritime alliances like NATO or the partners in the Indo-Pacific are built on mutual interest and the protection of a shared rules-based order. They are networks, not hierarchies. And in the 21st century, networks are far more resilient than empires. Professor Sarah Paine notes that successful interventions often share one key characteristic: the locals do the bulk of the fighting. This is the secret to maritime success. When a maritime power supports an ally, it isn't just sending soldiers to occupy land. It is providing the connective tissue, the intelligence, the logistics, the high-octane fuel, and the financial backing. Look at the immense coordination during World War II. The Allies were a mix of democracies and communists who shared a primary enemy. They coordinated their industrial output and shared their secrets, like the breaking of the Enigma codes. This level of cooperation is impossible for an autocrat who views every partner as a potential rival. Autocrats are lonely by definition. They cannot trust, and therefore they cannot truly collaborate. The strength of a maritime alliance is also found in its economic compounding. When you are part of the order, you aren't just protected by an army. You are protected by a global financial system. Sanctions, for instance, work best when they are a collective action. They are a tool of the Maritime Order to say, if you break the rules of sovereignty, you lose your membership in the global party. We see this today with countries like Finland and Sweden, longtime neutrals who realize that in the face of continental aggression, the only true security lies in being part of the network. They didn't join NATO because they were forced. They joined because they understood that an isolated nation is a vulnerable nation. Ultimately, superior alliance systems win wars because they distribute the burden of defense and maximize the pool of resources. A continental power must defend every inch of its border with its own blood and treasure. A maritime power, however, can leverage the strength of dozens of nations who all have a stake in the system's survival. This is why the Maritime Order has outlasted every major continental challenger for the last 2 centuries. It isn't just about who has the biggest gun. It's about who has the most friends who are willing to stand together when the stakes are highest. In a world of increasing complexity, the leader who stands alone is already on the path to defeat. In the modern era, the true battlefield is often not found on a map, but in the ledger of a global bank. This is where the Maritime Order exerts its most quiet, yet devastating power. For a continental power, war is about spending blood and iron to seize physical assets like factories or wheat fields. But in a maritime world, wealth is liquid, digital, and deeply interconnected. When a nation is excommunicated from this system through sanctions, it doesn't just lose a market, it loses its ability to grow. This is the slow-motion defeat that many leaders fail to see until it is too late. They mistake short-term resilience for long-term survival, failing to realize that compounding interest works both for your prosperity and for your decline. Sanctions are often criticized as being ineffective because they don't stop a war on day one, but that is half-court tennis thinking. The goal of maritime sanctions is not an immediate surrender. It is the systematic suppression of growth. By cutting off access to high-end technology, global capital markets, and convertible currencies, The Maritime Order ensures that the aggressor becomes weaker every single year while the rest of the world moves forward. Look at the stark contrast between North and South Korea over several generations. One is a global leader in innovation, the other is a historical relic. This isn't just about politics. It's about the compounding effect of being in or out of the global trading party. Professor Sarah Paine points out that since the Industrial Revolution, the wealthiest nations are those that adhere to international rules and commercial treaties. Why? Because the cost of protecting your own trade is astronomical if you have to do it alone. The Maritime Order provides a security umbrella that allows even small nations to thrive. When a continental leader breaks these rules, they are forced to build a self-sufficient economy. But in a world of complex supply chains, total self-sufficiency is a myth. You end up wasting your national treasure on inefficient domestic substitutes, turning your once vibrant economy into a hollowed-out military-industrial complex. You might have the tanks, but you won't have the microchips to run them or the hospitals to care for your aging population. The ultimate tragedy of the continental mindset is the misallocation of human capital. Instead of investing in entrepreneurs, scientists, and educators who can compete on the world stage, the state spends its wealth on secret police and censors to maintain internal control. This creates a brain drain where the most talented citizens flee to the maritime world, taking their innovations with them. A nation that cannot keep its best minds is a nation without a future. Finance, in this sense, is the ultimate judge of grand strategy. It rewards the cooperative and slowly starves the aggressive, proving that in the long run, the power of the credit card is more enduring than the power of the conqueror. As we look across the horizon of history, the patterns become undeniable. The rise and fall of empires are not dictated by fate, but by the choices of their leaders. The death ground trap is not just a military term, it is a profound warning about the limits of human ego. When a leader believes they can rewrite the rules of the 21st century with 19th century tools, they don't just lose a war, they lose the future. History tells us that the most successful nations are not the ones that took the most land, but the ones that built the most enduring bridges. Security is not found in the silence of a conquered neighbor, but in the strength of a voluntary alliance. The ultimate lesson of grand strategy is that you must be knowledgeable enough to make an accurate assessment of both yourself and the other side. You cannot play half-court tennis and expect to win. If you ignore the aspirations of other nations, if you disregard the power of global finance, and if you suppress the truth within your own borders, you are already on the path to a pivotal error. For those of us living within the Maritime Order, our duty is to protect the castle walls not through aggression, but through the consistent application of rules and the unwavering support of our allies. We must understand that our prosperity is a direct result of a system where everyone's sovereignty is respected. As you reflect on these stories of emperors and dictators, I want you to remember that the same principles apply to our own lives. Independence, self-reliance, and the pursuit of truth are the hallmarks of a healthy society. Just as a nation must maintain its internal checks and balances, we as citizens must stay informed and vigilant. We must not be seduced by the big lie or the promise of easy, efficient power. The messiness of our democracy is a sign of its health, and our ability to argue and self-correct is our greatest protection against the death ground that has swallowed so many others. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into the mind of grand strategy. I hope these insights help you see the headlines with a new clarity and a deeper sense of hope. If you found value in this analysis, I invite you to join our community. Subscribe and share this message with those you care about. We are all in this together, and by understanding the past, we are better equipped to build a future defined by peace, prosperity, and the enduring power of human freedom. I am here to walk this journey with you, and I look forward to our next conversation. Until then, stay curious, stay informed, and stay strong.